What's going on, Tamers? East here, and this week we're taking a look at the 6th week of the BT16 Beat Observer events that I just wrapped up over here in Japan and the rest of Asia. Is what I would be saying if the Digimon World Championships weren't coming up within the next 2 weeks of this video coming out. And after perusing the rules and the cards that are allowed for this event, I realized that the players going to the World Finals are going to be in a really interesting and tricky environment. No matter where you're coming from, this event is going to be pretty unexplored territory for pretty much everyone. And I say that because the rules allow only decks up to BT15, but also have the ban list implemented. With the finals happening the weekend of March 2nd and 3rd, and players in the West only getting access to BT15 as of the middle of February, means that the competitors are going to be sprinting to figure out what decks are good. Meanwhile, in the East, the BT16 set dropped on December 22nd, but the updated restricted list affecting cards like Anubismon, Apocalypmon, and the Garurumon cards didn't happen until January 5th. This means there was never an environment in Asia to test the BT15 cards without the updated restricted list, and this means that both sides are going into unknown waters in the World Finals. So what I'd like to do in today's video is take a look at some of the past statistics for the East and the West, as well as some of the cards in the BT15 set to see if we can figure out what decks we are likely to see going into the World Finals. Also, I want to present today's video with a caveat that this is pretty much all conjecture. I don't want some nasty tweet on Twitter or in Discord saying that East wasn't correct and I planned for the wrong things and he's to blame for me not winning the World Championships. I'm not coming at this with an authority perspective, I'm just trying to see if we can use data to make some educated guesses. That being said, let's take a look at some decks that were strong in the East, that were strong in the West, and see if we can figure out what decks we might see at the Worlds coming up. Let's first take a look at the events that I'm most familiar with in the East. Luckily, I do keep all of my meta report spreadsheets, so I can very quickly and very easily take a look at some of the top decks overall during the course of the BT15 meta. And while these statistics do contain decks that ended up being restricted, things like Apocalypmon, Garurumon, and Anubismon, I think we can look at the relative power level of other decks that didn't include those restricted cards to gauge what we might see at Worlds. In this case, things like Bloomlord and Quantumon or Quartzmon, as well as Finnerlugomon and the SOC cards. We're actually going to skip Leviamon and Beelstarmon because these two decks at the lower end ran the Garurumon engine, which means that they're likely not to be seen anymore. But if we skip past those, we can see things like Wargreymon, Yellow Vaccine, as well as Digipolice. Something to keep in mind as you look at these stats is that Ukomon and the Rui promo cards from the movie were not around during this entire set. Again, just speculation here, but I believe that if Ukomon and the Rui cards had been released much earlier in the set, really aggressive decks like Digipolice would have fared much better in this environment. Now let's take a look on the other side of the pond with events happening in the West. Now we don't have any BT15 data to look at because the set literally just dropped as of the making of this video. However, we can take a look at the BT14 and EX5 sets to see which of those decks are getting buffed. And while event results are a bit more sparse in the West, we can take a look at Eggman's events website and see that some of the more consistent decks that are topping things like Yellow Vaccine, Red Hybrid, which you just saw before. Mirage Galgamon actually topped quite a bit. I think it was very popular in Europe. However, keep in mind that the Bukomon card, the egg card that deck used, was restricted to 1, so likely not going to be seeing as much Mirage Galgamon. But other decks like Finnerlugomon and Shinegreymon were popular. Which brings us to the BT15 set. I want to take a look at some cards that I think will be impactful for some of the decks that are popular both in the East and the West we just talked about. Cards like, for example, Tyrannomon. This provides Finnerlugomon a card that has blocker, has the ability to draw cards, and build the trash all at the same time. And the fact that it can evolve off of an SOC card for 2 makes it hard to ignore how good this card is. Meanwhile, the Garurumon Ace here finds a perfect home in Red Hybrid, letting you play Tamers and destroy blockers in your way, so your Emperor Greymon can make attacks directly on security. Meanwhile, as we move down the list, cards like Gatomon and the Anjumon Ace are probably some of the best cards released in the entire set. Gatomon having the very powerful barrier ability, which means it's basically unkillable by battle, you can just drop a security instead, and the fact that it gains memory whenever that happens, alongside the Anjumon Ace. Unlike the Magna Anjumon Ace, hers is always going to be 6,000, and if you have 3 or less on any turn whenever you lose one, you can just recover immediately. This includes if your opponent makes a security check as well. Meanwhile, Palmon X Antibody is a perfect fit for the Palmon released in BT14. The BT14 Palmon lets you give an opponent's Digimon the effect that if it was rested during the turn, they would lose 2 memory. In fact, you would just gain 2 memory, but there was no way to actually proc that immediately. But with the Palmon X Antibody for 0 cost, you can do that and then gain the memory off of it. And lastly, Leviamon X Antibody is a pretty powerful card this set, letting you Digivolve from a Digimon who has an X Antibody option under it for free from the trash if your opponent plays Digimon by an effect is pretty powerful. And while Anubismon has been limited to 1 per deck, the Japanese finals showed us that you can run an Anubismon package inside of Leviamon and still have great results. So now that we looked at events in the East, events in the West, and some of the cards to the BT15 set, now let's take a look at some of the decks we're likely to see during the World Finals. The first one here is Bloomlord. I mentioned before that the synergy between the BT14 Palmon here, giving your opponents Digimon -2 memory whenever they're rested, and the BT15 Palmon X Antibody, letting you rest a Digimon immediately after for 0 cost, is a great combination. You see that here in the deck. I didn't mention it before, but actually the Palmoline's antibody works with the Togemon from BT14, essentially letting you play 4-cost Tamers for free. And then on the top end we see cards like Quantumon with the ability to protect itself from effects of various different cards depending on what you choose every single turn. Outside of that though, this deck really isn't changed that much. Again, it's pretty much all the amalgamation of pieces collected for the past few sets. Next up is going to be Yellow Vaccine. We mentioned before in BT15, Yellow Vaccine gets access to Gatomon and the Anjumon Ace here, and we see inclusions of both those cards in the deck. With the deck having so many ways to stack cards in the security and then rip cards off by an effect, the Gatomon here fits in perfectly as a way to get free bodies on board. With the Gatomon setup, you have the ability to go into the Anjumon Aces on your opponent's turn for the Blast Digivolve to keep your opponent in check. I think it's really hard to build for the second level 5 slot here. I think some people opt to go with maybe an Anjumon Ace here just to get more recovery. I've opted to go with the Shinranmon here just because I want a bit more aggression and being able to unsuspend and then make another attack and potentially get another Gatomon on board. However, I think it really comes down to a building preference. I'm not a world-class player, but I am afraid of running all aces for my level 5s, and so for that reason you see the Shinranmon here. Moving over to Red Hybrid, we finally see Ukomon rear its ugly head, and I mean that literally, by the way. The Ukomon letting you keep tempo as well as being an extra source of memory whenever you pull Digimon out of raising makes an already fast deck faster. And because this deck naturally has so many level 4s because you're typically evolving them over your Tamers, the Grudomon Ace is always a threat. And finally we come to Fenrir Lugomon and the rest of the SOC cards. Some of the BT15 cards, including things like the Lugomon here, are a great way to get rid of your opponent's floodgates that prevent you from doing your OTK, as well as the single copy of the Tyrannomon that we mentioned before, as a blocker, a searcher, and a trash filler all at the same time. Looking over some of the event results from the West, it feels like the Mist Memory Boost card is actually far more favored than the actual Purple Memory Boost, so in the case that we have both Western and Asian players running this deck, I'll be interested to see what the ratios for this card look like. So with that, we're going to bring this Worlds discussion video to a close. I do want to say though that there are a couple of honorable mentions I didn't really talk about during this video. The first of those being Numamon and Monzaimon. While I think that those cards got some really important pieces in BT15, they are still lacking a couple of critical pieces in I think the BT16 Valkyriemon Ace, as a way to give a blanket minus 5000 DP on your opponent's turn. I think is really powerful and it's kind of necessary. As well as the BT16 Ukomon that allows you to search cards whenever something comes out of the breeding area. I personally believe that these two cards are pretty integral to the deck's success, and without them I think it kind of falls apart. If any of the Worlds Finals are running this deck though, I'll be interested to see what they come up with to make up for that. The second deck here is Security Control. This is a deck that I think is far more popular in the West than it is the East, and so I don't have a lot of information about how Security Control plays. I don't see it very often in my own locals. I have almost no interest in playing it myself, and while I'm usually surprised seeing it in the West, I won't be surprised if I see it at Worlds. All that being said, Worlds is quickly approaching us. I could not be more excited. Let me know what you guys think of some of the decks that are going to be brought by the players there. Anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Before you get out of here, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.